Good afternoon, little brother.
Good afternoon, big brother.
This is the Pseudo Scholars Podcast, where we believe that science isn't just for scientists. Science is for anyone with integrity who honestly knows or wants to know more about the world. Each week, we put on our scientific hats and we grapple with some of the most challenging and important questions that we can think of.
Yeah, the questions that we like about are what's the future of transportation? How's the fossil fuel industry going to change over time? And maybe even how did Donald Trump win the election using big data analytics in a way that we've never seen a politician do before? These are the kinds of topics that we want to take a dive into and explore. We want to challenge our own conventional thinking, and then we want to walk away a little more informed, stimulated, and inspired. So what we're talking about today is really about living well. And if we want to live well, we've got to start with how do we think well? So that's the topic that we're going to jump into today. We want to explore what it means to think well. So this is going to be a two-part series, Shane's idea. Part one that we're doing today is going to be what is bad thinking? Really, we're going to be talking about cognitive biases. So what are they, and why do they make us think so badly as human beings? Whereas part two, we're going to focus more on good thinking and the quest for rationality, the quest for being logical and arriving at the best outcomes in our day-to-day decisions.
Yeah, so Cade, I think to get started, we need to talk about what it means to think and define basically how our brain processes information. Basically, every time we take an action in life, it tends to be based on the way that we process inputs into our brain. So we're processing inputs that come into our brain, and those allow us to make decisions which we see as outputs, essentially. But sometimes we make really good decisions, and sometimes we make very poor decisions. It's really just a result of how we're processing the information. And that's what we want to talk about today. How do negative processes start to take place? Well, let's think about a positive experience. Let's say, for example, you touch a hot stove. Biological inputs basically are flooding your brain with warnings that are screaming like, hey, keep this up, buddy, and you're going to get burned. So quickly, our brain sends a signal, down to, or our hand sends a signal up to our brain. That's the input, basically saying heat, heat, heat. And we determine an output really quickly. In this case, the brain just sends a signal back down to the hand, commanding it to be lifted from the hot stove. That's really good thinking. That's helpful for our own survival. But what if the brain decided something, Cade, like what if it said, screw it, like I don't really want to use that hand anymore, and never sent the command down to the hand? That would be really bad thinking. You would get burned. Right. So that's the sort of dangerous types of thinking that we want to delve into today.
No, yeah, that's a really important question to ask. I wonder if we need to make kind of a clarification a little bit, Shane, for maybe two different types of thinking. Well, one is in the example that you talked about, which is where it's going to be kind of a biological environment that we're responding to. We have some kind of context, some kind of input, some kind of derived output. But I imagine that not all of our decisions, not all of our ways that we process information are going to be just purely biological.
Right. I mean, the human brain's had millions of years to experience stuff like hot stoves or what it means to touch fire. It's pretty black and white. But what happens when the inputs don't have a very obvious output? They don't indicate a necessary output. What about really difficult questions like, should I vote for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton? Should I marry my girlfriend? Should I believe in God? Like, there's a ton more processing that's going on in the brain before we can handle those inputs and come up with a good decision, an output. So I think today it's not our position to argue that there's always a right or wrong question to those decisions that I just posed. But I think what we do want to argue today, that I'm going to try to argue today, is that there is a very good way and a very bad way to go about processing those inputs. So after studying the way people think for that last couple of weeks, which is what I've spent quite a bit of time on, I'm pretty convinced that people, including me, spend a lot of their lives in almost a disillusioned state because of really bad processing. Bad thinking. So that's what we want to get into today.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And again, the delineation is we're not going to talk about valuation, right? Is Trump the better candidate or is Hillary the better candidate? There's some subjectivity, and that will be a whole nother podcast topic for the pseudo scholars to tackle down the road. But we're really talking about the process that we undergo as thinking human beings to come to decisions about what we think is true and what we think is going to be the best output for our lives.
Yeah. So, Cade, there's one really interesting economic theory that I'm going to leave up to you to explain if you can, because I think it sets a tone for the way that we've always thought human beings behaved and how we're going to show here today that it's not necessarily true. So could you tell us about rational choice theory?
Yeah. So at rational choice theory, so I want to preface this by saying that if you open any economics 101 book in any undergraduate class in college or high school, you're going to see a bunch of decisions or a bunch of assumptions rather listed on that first chapter, basically that's saying we can't have any more discussions about economics or do any kind of economics or apply math to economics until we agree on kind of what is our playing field going to be. And that's kind of what rational choice theory is. That's the way that people need to think about it. So it's kind of defined as individuals are always going to make prudent or logical decisions when faced with a rational set of choices. So door A, door B, door C, we're assuming that each individual is going to be able to kind of think about the costs and benefits and then walk through whichever door they believe is going to be most conducive to their well-being or whatever outcome they're desiring. So that's really what rational choice theory is. And we have to make a lot of those assumptions to do economics, to even do science in some cases. But Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel laureate in economics, and he actually isn't an economist, but he's the first Nobel laureate in economics ever who's not an economist because his research was so foundational to the way that we think about thinking that they had to give him this award in this field that isn't directly his field of expertise. But he's a professor at Princeton, and what he's shown is that there are several ways where human judgments and decisions over time and in repeatable circumstances actually oppose rational choice theory. So Kahneman is essentially saying that we're not as rational as the economic textbooks are saying.
That's right. And he did this by introducing a concept that we now call cognitive biases, which may be something that people are comfortable with and have heard examples of. There's the very common one, confirmation bias, and there's several other that we're going to get into today. But Kahneman introduced these biases and talked about how they influence the way that we think and showed very clearly that we are not as rational. We're not as good thinkers as we might presume. So I think, Cade, we need to define what cognitive biases are and get into how these impact our thinking. So what is a cognitive bias?
Right. So what Kahneman would say is that cognitive bias is a deviation from rational judgment that leads us to make illogical conclusions about people or situations. So really, we're not making the best, most logical decisions in our everyday lives, and that cognitive biases are basically the kind of the intuition, so to speak, if you want to think about it that way, that enable faster decisions. So when we're faced with a situation that's time sensitive, you and I are going to do the very least amount of thinking that we possibly can to achieve what we think kind of at a gut level is the best outcome. And so what he says is our intuition is really filled with these biases that we undergo, and that it's really maybe not the best way to think about decisions when there's not a time-sensitive manner, right? You've talked about biological systems. If I'm going to get my hand burned, let's act with intuition, but most of the time, it's really not the case, right, Shane?
Yeah, exactly. But let's give another example of how cognitive biases may have been developed from an evolutionary biological standpoint. So let's imagine our ancestor, Mr. Homo sapien. He's roaming out in the eastern savanna in East Africa, and a saber-toothed tiger pokes his head out of the jungle or something, and he sees the saber-toothed tiger before the saber-toothed tiger sees him. What's he going to do? Is he going to approach the saber-toothed tiger and pet him? Is he going to run? Is he going to hide? His reactions are obviously to be run and hide, get away from this predator that's bigger and stronger and is going to eliminate my existence. But why does Mr. Homo sapien feel that way or think that way? Well, it's probably because a year ago he saw his father get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. So in this case, we've developed in the Homo sapien a cognitive bias that is going to be beneficial for his own survival. So cognitive biases aren't necessarily all evil, all necessarily bad. We have biases that are important, but I think the argument today is that we're not often in a room with saber-toothed tigers anymore. And so we can probably apply a different type of thinking than Mr. Homo sapien was applying in the eastern savanna there. So before we can kind of get into what good and bad thinking is in terms of the scientific logic, we've got system 1 and system 2 thinking. We should define them, Cade. Can you tell us what system 1 thinking is?
Right. So what System One thinking is really talking a little bit more specifically about that intuition, right? That gut level instinctual thinking where we're really taking shortcuts and responding based on whatever biases we might have, wrong or right, and searching in different situations in order to come to a quick decision that is going to lead to the best outcome. So where we see people that are acting out of the System One thinking, obviously is going to be in places where they're under intense stress, where thinking is really so effortful in whatever situation they're dealing with, that they really want to go with the most intuitive direction, and just making that choice is freeing in that situation. So that's where we're going to see a lot of System One thinking. And it was necessary, right? That's kind of our point, is that in different contexts, System One thinking is not just sometimes the best way of thinking, but it's also the only way that you can think when faced in certain situations. But I guess the staple of this podcast is trying to conjecture the fact that we don't actually face situations where we need to use System One thinking near as often as we do, right? We should use System Two.
Right. And System Two is that rational, logical thinking. How do we handle those questions, the three questions from the beginning? Should I be voting for Trump or Hillary? Should I marry my girlfriend? Should I believe in God? These require tons of more processing. We should be thinking about information. We should be thinking about data, not depending on shortcuts, essentially, or survival mechanisms. So the thing here in 2017 is that there are very rarely saber-toothed tigers in the room. And so therefore, we probably we shouldn't be using biased information to make big decisions. Because the truth is, I think the reason we do this, though, Cade, is because cognitive biases make really quick and easy decision-making easier. It's just more powerful and quick and easy for us. And by nature, we tend to be quite lazy. I know that I can be honest with myself and say that I can be a lazy thinker at times and just trust experiences and memories and make decisions based off of that rather than crunching the numbers. Because rational, logical thinking is hard, and it hurts a lot when we find out that what we've always believed to be true isn't in fact true. And so getting to that point can be pretty challenging.
Right. And I know we have some kind of examples so that people can kind of picture where you might see this kind of flesh out in your own life. And so I was actually in a leadership training the other day, and our instructor was trying to enlighten our minds to this kind of concept of how we all have biases. We all have perceptions that aren't always accurate, right? So we've done some of these little exercises, but I found this one pretty interesting. So he showed us a card, and on the card was a sentence, and the sentence was not, it wasn't really coherent. It was really just a bunch of words written in a row. And he just said, hey, look at the card for 30 seconds, right? So everyone knows there's some kind of trick. So we're really focused. We're really trying to think, okay, what does this mean? What's he going to test us on? What's he going to ask, right? And so then he said, okay, turn your back over, and then I'm going to give you another 10 seconds, and I want you to tell me all the F's that are in this sentence, just the number of the letter F's that are used, right? So we turn it back over. You come up with our number. I sentence quite a few times. I look around at me and see if other people are done. Makes me feel better. Okay, I turn my card over, say, all right, I've got my number, right? And so he starts holding up hands. He says, how many people saw two F's? And I would say like 60% of the room, and my hand included, right? Throw up our hand. We saw two F's in the sentence. And he goes, how about 3? How about 4? How about 5? And I was just amazed that other people saw all these different numbers of F's. Well, you turn the card back over, and it actually had 7 F's in this one little sentence that I missed. Because, and really the trick was that the F's were at the beginning of the sentence. So in the word of, my mind wasn't seeing the fact that of also has an F in it as well. So the point is just that I used my intuition. As soon as I saw F at the very beginning of each word, I thought, okay, how many words have the beginning F? And I was right in that case. But I really didn't take into account the whole question, and I didn't really think in a flexible, robust way. I really just wanted to get to the answer as fast as I could. So that's just kind of one example. Well, you got another one?
Yeah, another one is the bat and ball test. This one became pretty famous through Kahnemans' research. But you have a bat and a ball that cost $1.10. But let's say the bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the bat cost? A bat and ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more. How much does the bat cost? 85% of MIT students surveyed jumped to the same exact answer, the same answer that I have to say mistakenly I jumped to. The bat costs $1 is what everybody says. And what they're doing here is basically taking a shortcut. They're shorting out what they know from third grade arithmetic, that in actuality, if the bat was going to cost $1 more than the ball, and they cost $1.10 together, the bat would only be $1.05. So it's another example of how we basically are just shorting situations when we're in an uncertain situation. When we require thought and effort, we often don't carefully evaluate the information and pay attention to relevant statistics.
Right. No, it's absolutely something that everyone can see. If you've done any of these kind of little exercises, you've been exposed to them, you'll see how your brain is lazy naturally, especially if it feels comfortable. And that's a thing that we've got to be most careful of, Shane. And where do we feel most comfortable? Inside our own minds, right? With our own thoughts, with our own worlds. That's where we feel comfortable and where we really can be susceptible to these cognitive biases. And so one type of bias, or what we call these blind spots. We talked about this in training. The Greek word for blind spots are scotomas. So we would talk about as a team, where does our team have scotomas in the way that we evaluate what we're trying to do and what we're trying to accomplish in this project to get to the desired outcome. Right? So we naturally assume that everyone is more susceptible to thinking errors than we are. And that's the problem with these blind spots, is the fact that we are blind to them. That's the challenge. But what's really interesting as we talk about these is that we're really, really good at identifying blind spots in other people. Right? Put me in a room and I can tell me what this person's political views are, tell me what their religious beliefs are, tell me what they think about this, that, and the other. And I can tell you, oh, they believe it because of this, and this is where they're blinded. It's because of this situation, or because they had this kind of circumstance, or they haven't evaluated the data, or whatever it may be. And it makes me feel good about my world. But the problem is that the data says that I'm actually just as susceptible to blind spots as they are.
Isn't that fascinating, though, that we are really good at being critical? I know that I, in times in my mind, will praise myself when I'm not necessarily critical, but like I draw a correct conclusion on another person's behavior. Like, yes, I saw that coming. Like, well done, Shane, you saw it coming. But why am I so bad at seeing those in myself? I suspect it has something to do with the fact that when we're looking at another person's life and behaviors, we're really just evaluating the information that's at hand. We can see, the guy who's in a terrible relationship who refuses to break up with a girlfriend even though she's taking advantage of him. We can all see from the outside, oh, this is such a clear case, guy. Like, get out of there. She's horrible for you. You're miserable. You're suffering. Why are you doing this? But he just can't. He's emotionally so connected, and he's just incapable of making the rational, logical choice. And that's how we tend to get in our own minds, whereas we're not so bad at it when we're thinking about other people. Isn't that funny?
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. And obviously there are some decisions that we face where it's pretty exact, or maybe even it's measurable what the right outcome is. But in other areas where it's subjective, I find that this bias still exists on things that are purely opinionated, right? Where they can't be proven. I just think that I'm right. And I would argue to say that no one really knows this very well until they get married. Until you get married, you don't really see all of these blind spots, or really just the fact that you think you're right about almost everything. And it's really unbelievable. It's super arrogant when you think about it. When you think about our constraints as human beings and our personal experiences, what we don't know is far more than what we do know. But I found this to be the case when Emily and I are deciding, where to go eat, or what we're going to order at a restaurant, or all these little mundane tasks. And I literally think something totally opinionated and subjective that I'm right and that she's wrong. And that's really just highlighting another one of my scotomas, which is the fact that I'm actually seeing the decision as black or white, when oftentimes it's not, right? And so then you got to kind of understand what the other person's thinking. But anyways, the point is simply just that marriage has helped me see my scotomas in a way that So Shane, what other cognitive biases are out there? We've talked about the blind spot. What else is out there?
This one's one of my favorite ones because I'm a primary member of the Bandwagon Effect. So the Bandwagon Effect is the probability that one person is very likely to adapt the belief of other people based off of the number of other people that believe that belief. So this is the idea of the Golden State Warriors having a huge new following, even though they've only been good in basketball for the last 3 years.
Right. Group thinking, right? It's sometimes it's a bad idea. Going with the crowd is not always the right thing to do. And where we see this a lot of times is that people really become comfortable when they're in environments where they share responsibility with other people. And so that's kind of part of what we do, I think, in our biases as being lazy thinkers is, well, I'm now just going to live off the thoughts of these other people in this room. And then what happens is everyone's being lazy together. So they all arrive at the kind of similar conclusions, which may or may not be right because no one's really thinking about it critically. And so you kind of see this in the corporate world oftentimes when we're in a meeting and people are just agreeing with each other. And it's like, oh, it's because no one's thinking rationally or critically about this, or we'd come to different conclusions. That's kind of that group think problem. What else we got?
Here's another really challenging one, the availability heuristic. So this is when people are overestimating the importance of information that they've been exposed to because they've had a limited exposure. So the best example of this is the guy who says, well, smoking can't be bad for you. My grandmother lived till 90 and smoked every day in her life. He's had that experience that has impacted him so dramatically because he was so close with his grandmother and he experienced that he can't look at the data. He can't see the number of people who are dying every year from lung cancer caused by inhalation of like tobacco products. So we oftentimes apply ourselves in a way of thinking that's closest to what we've experienced, which is just harmful generally.
Yeah. And so for all our lawyer friends out there, we got some cousins and some friends that are finishing up law school or just finished up law school. This is that anecdotal evidence that everyone's talking about, right? Use one personal example to disprove what, and it may or may not be right? That's not what the point of this conversation is. Not that your experiences are wrong. It's just that your experiences might not tell the whole story. And so you need to think about it more holistically. But, the politicians are great at this, Shane, right? So, Bill Clinton, who was the savviest of savvy, the second coming of JFK in so many ways. He'd get up there with his little Arkansas accent. He'd come up there and he'd talk about this new government program because little Miss Peggy that lives down the street, she's 72 years old and she's going to, and of course we're not trying to belittle those situations, but what we're just saying is that's not a good way to think about policy. That's not a good way to think about large scale decisions when we have time to think about it. So anyways, that's definitely one of those biases. Another one I wanted to talk about really quickly, Shane, was confirmation bias, which should be one of the easiest ones to grasp over this podcast. It's just the fact that you're more likely to listen to, hang out with, talk to people that think the exact same way that you do. Right. And we see that in so many ways. We see that in the way that people congregate amongst different racial groups, amongst different socioeconomic groups. People that are going to have really similar experiences are from really similar backgrounds. And what happens is that people become just sometimes we call it the holy huddle. They just become indwelt in the way that their group thinks, that they tend to only think and expose themselves to those same kind of thoughts, which just further validates the same environment that they've always grown up in, right? And so it's a lack of diversity. It's a lack of exposure to other ideas, other people, and it really leads us to just validate what might be, incorrect biases.
Yeah, imagine how dangerous confirmation bias is if you're caught up in the wrong crowd. I mean, imagine an organization like the KKK or like a Nazi organization where necessarily not everyone recognizes like the immoral and unethical implications of organizations like that, but they're very, very powerful. This is why cults are very, very powerful, because of confirmation bias. So arguably confirmation bias could be one of the most dangerous to be a member of, and it's something we all have to try to avoid as best we can. One really good one, I think, Cade, for the audience to be thinking about is the anchoring bias. I know that I'm a suspect to this one as well. So people are just very, very reliant on the very first piece of information they hear. It's the very first piece of information that sticks in their mind for whatever reason and is the one that they tend to stick with. So when asked the question, how tall is the tallest tree in the world? It's over 100 feet. That 100 feet becomes part of the anchor. And people who've been asked that question tend to guess something that's close to the 100 feet realm. On average, people guess 118 feet. But when the question is asked like this, how tall is the tallest tree in the world? It's under 500 feet. People use 500 as the anchor, and people tend to guess something around the range of 430 feet. So the reality is that the trees are about 300 feet, if I remember correctly. But people are always anxious to kind of latch on to the first piece of information. You get that first headline, that first Twitter feed that comes across, and you're like, great, I got it. I want to retain that, and now that is truth for me. Great.
Right. And oftentimes that's just because we want to have something to talk about at the water cooler, right? We want to just have an opinion formed about things, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Again, we're just talking about how do we think better, and we're highlighting it in the negative today. Right? What do we do that that's poor, were some of our shortcomings. Kind of the last one we wanted to talk about was conservatism bias, which basically just means that people are less likely to change their mind when new evidence arises if they already are fairly certain about what they think. So if you ask someone on a scale of 1 to 10, how sure are you about this? Then if I show you some evidence that confirms that, you're just getting more and more anchored into what you already think. So it just opens up a question that I would pose to you, Shane, is that on big, if I'm trying to think about a practical application for this, but maybe your questions, right? Should I believe in God? Should I marry this girl? And should I vote for Trump, right? Those are kind of our 3 questions. Oftentimes we're not making a choice until a certain point in time. So we would say gather as much data, try to remove your biases. We'll talk about some practical things down the road before you make a decision. But there are other times where we really need to hold a position in the meantime. So it's kind of this conservative bias. We're always taking in more information and more evidence. So I wonder if you think that it's a bad way to think to have decisions made about things based on the certain amount of information and data that you've been able to process, but then just being open to, over time, allowing more information to flow in and being willing to change your position if so, but in the short term, you kind of have to have an opinion about it. Does that make sense? I don't know if that was confusing.
Makes sense. No, I think that's a really good question, but I think I either disagree with you or I'm going to answer in the negative to your question. If you would have asked me that 5 years ago, especially during my time in the Marines, I probably would have told you it's more important to have a position, hold a position, and hold it as strong as you can until information presents itself that leads you to need to change your position, and be flexible and agile and change your position. But I would say now, as it relates to our big 3 questions, and probably most of the questions that we're tackling in this podcast, Cade, I'd say my answer is to be comfortable saying, I don't know. I think it's far better, and after my research into this world, I think it is just far more beneficial. I think we're far more likely to come to the correct conclusion if we're comfortable saying that I don't know the answer to the question, the Trump-Hillary question initially, despite the way that the media is hitting me from the left and the way that the media is hitting me from the right, and despite my parents, the way that I was raised. As best we can, let's put all that aside and say, for now, there's positions on both sides of the fence, and I plainly can say with all sincerity that I just don't know until more information presents itself, but I'm going to go and get that information, and I'm going to do it in a rational and critical way, which is how we're going to get what we're going to really dive into next week.
Right. So so I guess the challenge with my question then, or the flaw in my question, is that some of these examples, and obviously we're not going to get into them specifically, don't have a kind of a time-sensitive nature, but you can imagine where they do have a time-sensitive nature, and all of a sudden making these decisions is a little bit more complex, especially when there's not necessarily a specifically correct outcome, such as, should I marry this girl, right? Because we all know the guy that sat on the ring for too long. And he blew it, right? We all know the guy that couldn't make up his mind. He was back and forth. He was wishy-washy. And the girl said, you know what? There are other fish in the sea. I'm going to go and check out, if there are other. And then all of a sudden, he kind of has that buyer's remorse, or the lack of buyer's remorse there at the end, where he says, you know what? It really would have been the right decision. I might not have had enough data. But, it's just kind of an interesting question to say, how much data do we need before we take that initial position, and then keep our minds open to changing that position as we receive more data? Because a lot of these things affect your life, right? We're not talking about pithy little questions. Should I buy this glass or that glass? That's going to have very little effect on your life. We're talking about how people come up with their value systems, how people make decisions about complex policies and how they think the world works and what's best for the world and things.
Yeah, I think there's no easy answer for that. One principle that I think is probably pretty beneficial is to search for a 70% solution and then execute it violently until more information comes available to you. So rather than jumping into a position and holding a position, work as diligently as you can within the time clock that's provided to you. In the case of the girlfriend situation, if she's getting ready to walk out the door, you might have to make a decision more quickly, as opposed to if you've just started the relationship. But work towards a 70% solution as best you possibly can. Execute that as best you can until more information presents itself. But there's another great example that's going on today. I mean, in terms of politics, we were talking Trump and Hillary, but I think we can announce right now, I've just seen the breaking news come across the screen, that France is not going to participate in this big movement that's going on internationally right now, the populist, nationalist type candidate. They voted strongly against Marine Le Pen. It looks like she's lost something like 60% to 30%. So she's out, which looks like France is not going to leave the European Union, Frexit. They've voted for this moderate character. But isn't it interesting, Cade, that it seems that at least in this past election, there's something like 30% of voters who hadn't made up their mind until they got into the voting booth. That to me is very concerning, because those are the types of characters who are going to get into the voting booth and depend on biases, and maybe just one particular emotion is going to tip the scale and force them to make a decision that arguably could be quite dangerous. I mean, I would just say, I don't know if this might be kind of anecdotal, but looking at what I've seen with France, maybe if the French electorate was a little bit more diligent in their thinking and their decision-making processes.
Yeah, no, that I think you bring up a really good example of where we would see that bias take place. And I would probably even press you a little bit, and not you, but press the statistic that said most people don't have their mind till they go in there. I bet they don't know that their mind is already made up before they go in there. And so that there's a scotoma on top of that scotoma right there. There's a blind spot that they can't see, that really they're not open to the fact that they're going to cast a vote for someone else. I would actually probably categorize it as the same kind of conflict that most people had when they went there, which is, here's the party I normally align with. These are the values that I tend to vote with, but I don't like this candidate. That's where both parties found themselves. And so people that normally vote straight party go in there thinking that, I'm willing to not vote for someone else, but at the end of the day, you just don't like your candidate, but you're still gonna align with those values. And the decision was made long ago. So I would probably just say that I'm not sure I buy the ability of people to answer that question honestly.
Okay, that's a pretty good point. But I still think that like the general message today is that the data doesn't really tell a lie here, at least in the evidence that Kahneman's shown. He has a fantastic book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is required reading for every Google employee, by the way. So that's a book that's worth checking out. But in his research that won him this Nobel Prize, he's basically been capable of showing us that we aren't making rational and logical decisions in most cases. So how do we get better at this? Obviously, we need to do the very first thing, I think, which is just recognition, is what we're trying to do here today, Cade, and say that generally when we come into these topics and pseudo scholars, we want to try to take them with a blank sheet, with no preconceived biases or information that might not necessarily be beneficial. Information based off of something somebody told us on the street, or information based off of something we experienced 10 years ago, and keeping in mind that our memories are sort of loose and not always the best. So like,
Right.
If we can come at these things recognizing first and foremost that we have biases and we need to do our best to remove them, that might be the place that we get started. How else do you think that we can do better in managing cognitive biases?
Well, I know we have some other practical ones, but I wanted to ask one question for myself and for anyone that might be listening that's interested in specifically what you're talking about with respect to Kahneman's research. But I wonder, because it's not a purely biological system that he's always dealing with, or a pure biological experiment. So I wonder, how exactly is he qualifying that we're making bad decisions? Like, are people telling him beforehand, this is the outcome that I desired, but this is the decision I made in it, and it's the opposite of the outcome that I desired? Is it that specific?
No, most of them are far more like quantifiable, measurable examples, like the ones that we talked about, the bat and the ball.
Okay.
Maybe even the gorilla and the basketball. Do you know that case?
Yeah, so the gorilla and the basketball, and it's pretty famous, right, Shane? So it should be on YouTube if you just Google it. Now, this is another one. This is another scotoma that got me. I hate to say it, but my blind spots were just being exposed during this training. But so essentially, you had two teams, and there were three players on each team, and they had white shirts and they had black shirts. And each team had a basketball, and they stood kind of in a circle. And the rule was that they could only pass it to other people on their own team. So you didn't need to worry about, black shirt throwing it to a white shirt. They could only pass amongst themselves. And all you had to do was look at the white team and say, how many passes did they complete? And I think it was 45 seconds or a minute or something like that. So they're moving in a circle and they're kind of intertwining. So it's not, completely clear. But the fact of the matter is that it was not hard at all to tell. The white person just completed another pass, another white t-shirt threw another pass, and I counted them up, right? So at the end of it, I'm almost sweating because I'm bearing down right here, making sure I don't blow it on the second exercise. And he says, how many passes did they complete? I said 17. He said, you're right. Now let me ask you a question. Did you see the gorilla? I said, gorilla, what are you talking about? So he goes back and he shows us the video again. And because I was so focused on looking at the number of passes from people in white t-shirts, I didn't recognize that as a gorilla that walked right into the middle of the circle, beat its chest like this. Of course, it's not a real gorilla. But anyways, and then it walked right on out of there. I didn't even see it. I mean, I couldn't even remember. If you just said something walked out there, what kind of animal was it? I couldn't even, contrive of that kind of thought. So anyways.
Well, Cade, so what happens basically is that Kahneman takes examples like that to answer your question. Most of the cases are something that could be quantifiable and repeatable, measurable, all the things that are necessary to apply the scientific method in his research.
Right.
But what he's done is shown that people get these things incorrect. And while they don't seem necessarily that harmful, oh man, just because you couldn't find the gorilla doesn't mean that Cade's a bad decision maker and is going to make bad decisions in life. He does a really nice job kind of progressing the way neurologically that if we're not getting those things correctly, how quickly we're able to get much more impactful decisions incorrectly as well. So he draws a nice neurological chain from those simple questions to the more complex questions, the Trump-Hillarys, and why biases impact those decisions, although they're much harder to measure, as we've probably pointed out so far.
Right. All I wanted to do is simply cast the idea that oftentimes, if we take the MIT question about the bat and the ball and how much they cost, it can be slightly different. I think the conclusion is inferred and implied, and it's accurate, that if we can't even get these kind of questions correct and we apply lazy thinking, then how am I going to make the right decision about who to marry? We're not at all suggesting that Kahneman has any kind of process for telling us what the right person to marry is, right? We're really just talking about the process of getting there. So I just wanted to make that clear. But
that's very well said, kid. Well said.
Yeah, let's talk about kind of the other thing that we can do to try to help eliminate some of this confirmation bias. Right. And really this is kind of focused on a more systematic or maybe a policy type of action that could eliminate this. So if you're interested in this, think about how different, people that you're voting for, where they stand on this issue. But it's really about our education system. Right. And so we're going to have a whole nother podcast, and I'm really excited about unpacking our education system and the way that other people do education in different cultures, and what's the most effective way to get these healthy outcomes amongst our young people. But Neil deGrasse Tyson is really, he's a big advocate of teaching cognitive biases to kids before teaching them something, say, like arithmetic. And we really see this in other cultures, and push back on me because I don't want to unpack it. It's a great topic. But basically, let's teach our young people how to think. Let's teach them the flaws in their thinking, the things, the intuitions that are correct at times. We even something like this, a topic that we're unpacking, let's lay that foundation for how we actually make decisions before we say what's 2 + 2, and let's just kind of drill into you these kind of technical skills. And so really it's laying that foundation for thinking how to think, or learning how to learn, kind of a more classical view of education that Neil deGrasse Tyson is. So that's kind of another practical application. If we want to try to eliminate this, let's start educating people on this at a younger age, as opposed to allowing them to become more entrenched, right? Because based on our types of cognitive biases, this gets harder over time if it doesn't get deconstructed.
Right. And actually, Kahneman said something that's a little bit concerning. He said after about 2 decades of research into this topic and having won a Nobel Prize on it, he found that he was probably only incrementally better at eliminating cognitive biases and thinking better. So that doesn't speak well or bode well for people like you and I, Cade, whose brains are essentially deformed, are already formed.
Right.
Let's focus on the children, perhaps, in an educational format. So to get into that research a little bit, Neil deGrasse Tyson hasn't announced anything yet, the famous astrophysicist. He hasn't announced anything yet publicly, but I've been following him on Twitter and on a couple of podcasts. And it looks like that he's working with some major organizations in Europe and also in the United States to come up with some new education structure that would start at the base level of teaching kids how they're influenced. So that's pretty awesome. I mean, it's basically what you said. But to hear this from an astrophysicist, a theoretical physicist who contemplates our universe on a scale that you and I, or certainly I, cannot even begin to achieve, thinks that stop teaching kids mathematics in first, second, and third grade. Teach them how to handle the influences and dispel the things that are not helpful, take the information that is helpful, and make better decisions. So I wonder what this actually looks like tangibly. I mean, I can't exactly foresee how it's going to look, but I just expect that if we taught our kids about the influences, that they'd be better decision makers by the time they were adults.
Right. Well, if we're talking about children and we're saying that ultimately the best opportunity to kind of deconstruct this bad type of thinking, or, really exercise that brain, right? Keep it from being as lazy as it might naturally become over time, really falls on our parents, right? And you and I, neither of us are parents, but there's big implications. And again, this is another podcast topic, but how do you raise kids in the most effective way? And one thing I would just say is that oftentimes there are decisions that young people, little kids, aren't aware of what the right decision is, right? They're just not developed to that point, or they don't have enough data. And the parent does have enough data to say, this is bad, this is harmful, and I'm going to forcibly keep you from making this decision because I know this is unhealthy to you. But to some degree, I think we've all seen it in some of our parents, and I thought our parents did a pretty good job of this, but at least in other people, where really parents can be lazy themselves and just not explain the way that they make decisions to their kids, or why they're legislating their kids with whatever rules that they are in, because you got to live in some kind of tension. So really, what I think we want to avoid here is arbitrary decisions, right? That we don't just make decisions for no reason. That's not the way that the world works. No one really does it that way. But yet what we find is a society filled with people that are just arbitrarily in the place that they're in because they found the currents of life have pulled them there, right? That they're really being pressed in on by social constructs far more than they're rising above it intellectually, and then being able to make decisions about what they actually want to do and what they don't want to do. So really, I'm talking about parents being more robust in the way that they train their kids, the way they explain to their kids, how do I make decisions? How should you make decisions? Why am I forcibly keeping you from making this decision in this case? So I think it's another application.
That's a good point, because the research that I've come across, I haven't brought up yet, does show that our parents are to blame and are responsible for most of the biases that we come across, or at least apply later on in life. So I think now, based off of some of the research that Kahneman was showing and some other concurrent research I was looking at, potentially the argument is now leaning in the direction that nature has more of a role to play in who we are as individuals by the time we are grown, as opposed to nurture. That's something we can argue about another time. Nature seems to be playing more of a role when we look at genetics. But where we get caught up is with the biases and the influences that are brought upon from the way that we're raised and the people that we're exposed to at a young age. So handling all of those things is really important. But I would say that one other thing, Cade, people can be doing is just educating themselves. I mean, I'm trying to get better at this because I know I'm so vulnerable to thinking poorly and depending on shortcuts and these quick type thinking. I'm taking a MOOCs course right now. And for people who don't know about MOOCs, it's really awesome. These massive open online courses that are always free, in at least the cases that I'm exploring. And specifically the platform I'm using is called edX. So it's developed by MIT and one of the bigger professors in the education program there at MIT. And they have tons and tons of great coursework, everything from electrical engineering to this course that I'm taking on thinking well. So it's a 13-week course. It's pretty intensive. I mean, obviously, we're going through some of Kahneman's research and we're getting into all of this stuff. But just it goes back to the relevancy and recognizing that we have an issue here and doing our best to prevent these biases in the way that we think. Further educating ourselves is important.
Right. No, I completely agree. And just to put a bow on our kind of our applications, we're talking about, again, is we're not talking about biological decisions where I have to make a gut level instinctual call, or I'm a Marine and I'm in Afghanistan and I've got to rely on my training because I don't have time to process all the data, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about when I'm making a big life decision. So in the short term, if any of this makes an impact on us at all, then what to me the principal factor is that don't be so arrogant as to think that your way of thinking is better than other people. And so I'll take us back, and Kahneman's doing some unbelievable things, but I think Solomon said it pretty well in Proverbs 15, and Shane and I disagree on a lot of things in the realm of Christianity and religion, but I think we'll both agree on this proverb, right? Plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors, they succeed. So that's one thing that I've done in my life. I really have tried to implement that robustly in my life, to invite other people that know me, that know my own biases, not that I'm just asking for advice, but I'm in intimate relationship with, so that when I do come up with these big decisions about, should I buy a house? When should I have children? What are the right value systems to raise my family? And I'm really inviting people that hopefully have some different biases, and other people that can look inwardly and analyze the data and help me make some of these decisions a little more correctly. So that's just another thing that you can do, is surround yourself with people that care about you, that are willing to speak into your life and call out some of those biases, because we all know that if we're left on an island, we all think we're the king.
I think that's a very helpful token of wisdom. And it does play into what we're going to get into next week. So, without going too much further down the line into what good thinking looks like, we're going to leave it for next week. Next week is about practicing rational and critical thinking. And there's really about 11 or 12 tenets that we've discovered that I think are going to be really helpful for people. There's something that I try to apply in my own life that eliminate these biases so that we can think better and make better decisions. And ultimately, to kind of bring it back to what you said at the beginning, Cade, I mean, thinking well is about living well. We are thinking conscious creatures. If we're living well, we're thinking well, and kind of vice versa. So rational thinking should get us there at least a part of the way.
I think you and I want to avoid the same thing in our life that we would encourage everybody that's ever listens to this to avoid. Don't find yourself in some arbitrary place in life. Geographically, in your job, who you're married to, don't let the current of other factors, even though they may be good and well-intentioned, and maybe it is correct in some cases. I don't think it's always that way, but don't let yourself just find yourself one day and you wake up and you just find yourself in the same spot because this is where life told you to be. Told you to go to high school, then go to college, then get married, then buy a car, then buy a house, and go through this system of progression that life tells you that's the only option. I think that's one thing we really want to fight, and we want to challenge that kind of conventional wisdom. So anyways, yeah, looking forward to getting into next topic, and bring your scholarly hats, because we're going to be unpacking Bayes' theory and the prisoner's dilemma and game theory and some of these other kind of approaches to how we think about making decisions, and we put data into it.
That's great. Well, I'm looking forward to it. And until then, little brother, I'll let you go.
All right. Talk to you later.
See ya.